My name is Jane Borowski. In 1988, when I was just 22 years old, I was attacked and stabbed 27 times and left for dead. I am a survivor. In the 1970s and 80s, women's bodies started to surface in the Connecticut River Valley between New Hampshire and Vermont. Is my case related to these cases? This is unknown. Why? Because all the cases still remain unsolved. Are all the cases related in the work of one serial killer? We don't know that either. But law enforcement did form a task force in the 80s to investigate all of them. I've joined forces with my co-hosts Amanda and Drew. Together, we are a voice for the voiceless. We advocate for those who cannot advocate for themselves while remaining factual and engaging with empathy. The Invisible Tears team is transparent and opinionated, never claiming to be anything we are not. We aren't law enforcement, we aren't private investigators or journalists. We are victim advocates who care and want to help families.
So make sure you subscribe to our podcast so you don't miss any episodes. You can find us on all platforms through our link tree in the show notes. There you can find our social media platforms, our YouTube, and our website with our merch. You can also find our Patreon there. So if you're interested in supporting and joining the Invisible Tears team, join our Patreon today. And as always, ratings and recommendations help our podcast in algorithms. So if you haven't shown us some love and given us a 5-star rating and review, please do so. We appreciate each and every one of you and your continued support. Welcome to Invisible Tears. Amanda here with Jane today.
Hi, Amanda.
Hi, Jane. How's it going?
Good.
Good. We are so excited to have Mike Gatto on as a guest today. And some of you may actually recognize Mike. He's a former California State Assembly member and does expert analysis on many national news platforms. But his experience in his personal life, though, combined with his professional, is what really makes his perspective on trauma and victim support and advocacy unique. And that's why we have him on today. So Mike published a book last year in 2024 that's called Noir by Necessity: How My Father's Unsolved Murder Took Me to Dark Places. So Mike, we can't thank you enough for taking the time to meet with us today. How are you doing?
Well, I'm doing okay. And thank you so much for having me. And thank you for all the work you do.
Thank you. So would you like to introduce yourself in any other fashion or outline
No,
any other
not at all.
career?
You did fantastic. And I think that's all that people need to know for now.
Okay, wonderful. I always like to give people that opportunity. You know, I can sort of summarize, but if there was something else that you...
I appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. So Mike, can you walk us and our audience through your father's murder?
Sure. So my father was one of those members of his community that I think every community has. He was, when he was killed, at least, he was an old Italian man, and he was one of those guys who, like, grew all sorts of produce in his backyard and always gave it to his neighbors and, everybody in the community. He was a retired teacher, somebody who had thousands of students who loved him and adored him for his dedication and what he taught them. He was a doting grandfather. He was a U.S. Army veteran. He was just, a terrific guy who, I would argue nobody deserves to be murdered, but my father really didn't deserve to be murdered. He was just a beloved member of the community. And when he was killed on a date that's very easy to remember. He was killed on 11/12/13. It was unique for several reasons. Number one, it was the only murder in his subdivision in Los Angeles that year. He lived in a very safe, very calm neighborhood. It wasn't super wealthy, but it was just a neighborhood where this type of thing didn't happen. Secondly, I was serving in the California legislature at the time, and I was at the height of my power, right? I was arguably the third most powerful person in the state of California. I was chair of the Appropriations Committee, which determined all the billions and billions of spending in the state every year. And so, it was instantly news. My father's case, which has been featured on Dateline NBC and so many different national outlets, it sort of rapidly became one of those Los Angeles and California murders that people talk about, like the Night Stalker and the Manson case and OJ. And for many, many months, it was front page news in the newspaper and, weekly news on television. And the case is still unsolved. And as we all talk about today, there's a lot of very, very strange things with my father's case.
Is it? It's still an open case, right? They're still investigating. It's not like gone cold or anything like that.
Well, I always wrestle with the definition of a cold case. I mean, it is definitely a cold case because it's a certain age and it has not yet been solved. But when you ask the police, they'll say, well, we're still actively investigating. We're still, doing this or taking tips or whatever. And so I think it's kind of in between. But look, I just talked with the detectives last week, so I like to think that they're still working on it.
Yeah. Now, how was your father murdered?
So my father was killed in the third floor of his own home, in his bedroom. At least that's where he was found. My dad lived in a Los Angeles neighborhood called Silver Lake. There's actually a lake, a reservoir. And his house, it's a very hilly neighborhood, so the houses are kind of built up. And so he had a third floor house, and the upper floor was just like a master suite. And he was found slumped at his desk with a gunshot wound in his abdomen that had entered his leg. And the police's best guess is that he was killed at nighttime, and then he was discovered the next day.
Now, I read somewhere that they had DNA, or they found DNA. Have they tested that?
So the DNA challenge has been a challenge in my dad's case, and I think it's a challenge in lots of cases. So first of all, I'll start by saying that most members of the public, and quite frankly, lots of law enforcement, have what people are now referring to as CSI effect. And of course, that refers to the CSI television show where, a murder is wrapped up in an hour with time for commercial breaks, nice and neat and clean because of some whiz bang technological thing. It's like, oh, we got DNA, and or it'll be like, well, the killer's cell phone pinged a tower, and it'll always be something like that where technology rides to the rescue. The first thing I start by telling people out there who care about victims and solving crimes is that the murder clearance rate, the murder solve rate, has gone down in the era of DNA. Police don't do what they used to do, which is talk to people, see if somebody starts sweating when they talk to them, start pulling out a thread and see where that thread takes you by talking to their friends, and so on and so forth. So in my father's case, there is a tiny, 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 tiny bit of DNA. And when I say tiny, I mean, the way that they've explained it to me is that the sample is so small that it's like, when you read those stories where they'll be like, they dug up a Neanderthal in a grave from France, and the skeleton was, 200,000 years old, but they drilled inside the teeth, and there was this little tiny minute about DNA that still existed, but it was so fragmented that there's gaps. That's how small the DNA is in my father's case. And I will also say that they think, but they're not 100% sure that it came from the assailant, right? It's not like it was underneath his fingernails or something like that. It was present in the house in a way that they think it was connected to the assailant. But, the fact that it's been, 12 years and they haven't gotten a hit, should, I think, be an indication of, whatever that is.
Did they find fingerprints or lift any
fingerprints
or anything?
There were unknown prints, in my father's house. But I forget how many different sets of unknown prints there were, but no matches have come up with those as well. What people should know about my dad is, he was a collector, which is, I guess, a polite way of saying that he had a lot of clutter, and he bought stuff from garage sales and thrift stores. And so, like, let's say there was an item right by my dad at his desk, or that they thought that perhaps one of somebody touched, right? They can't be sure if that was the clerk at the thrift store, that was my father's killer. So it's been a bit of a challenge.
That's tough. That is very challenging. Very, very. Have they received a lot of tips or?
Oh my gosh. Yeah. And that's one of the things I talked about in my book, is that the tips have been heartbreaking. And I know that other families with semi high profile and, somewhat high profile murders go through the same thing. But in my father's case, for whatever reason, I think because it was in the news, because I was a public figure and I was very easy to get a hold of, we had lots of heartbreaking tips. There were people who called me, if you can believe it, and they would say, like, at some point, the police had a profile of a person of interest and they put out a sketch. So it happened to me twice, actually, where somebody called and said, oh, the guy in the sketch is right outside my door. And we went over there, sirens blazing and everything like that, only to find out that that person really just had a homeless person in front of their house, and they were using me to try to get a police response because they felt that the police response was less than effective. I had a
Oh
yeah,
my God.
crazy.
Wow.
I had a soap star who had gone to my father's school. He had taught. She was a pretty accomplished actress, had rolled in some pretty big circles. She called me and said, hey, I've got some information on your dad's killing. And I said, okay, tell me. And she said, I'll only tell you in person. I said, okay. And, you know, I'm not thinking anything at this point. That sounds pretty credible. For the 2 weeks while we coordinated our schedules to try to get the lunch, everything like that, you know, I couldn't sleep. I was very excited. I felt like, well, this could be the tip that breaks the case open. We got to the lunch, and let's just say that it became clear that she had some mental health challenges, and her theory that she shared with me involved like Hillary Clinton and like, you know, like all sorts of really interesting stuff, you know, billionaires and things like that. And I had people suggest that my father's killing was connected to the Italian mob. I had, you know, we were of Italian descent. That's not the case. There were lots of pretty out there tips that we got. There were also some theories that were sort of more or less accepted, and I'm happy to go over those theories as well. The first theory that was published was by one of my father's neighbors, and I don't blame her. My father had a collection of paintings called icons. These are paintings that were made in Greece, the former Byzantine lands, plus Russia, the Eastern Orthodox cultures, you know, hundreds of years ago. And there was an antiquarian society that put out a flyer right before my dad's killing that said, you know, Joe Gatto is going to show up with his part of his rare and, you know, amazing collection of these paintings, and he's going to give a talk on this date. And my neighbor had the flyer, and she talked with the media. There's tons of media, you know, outside the house. And she said, oh, it must be the Russian mafia. And they said, why? And she gave him the flyer. And so that was the first theory that got out there in the media. Now, of course, the police, you know, and I diminished that theory because, first of all, these were not Van Goghs. I mean, these paintings were worth $5,000, not like 50 million. Secondly, whoever killed my dad walked right past them. They were like on the wall, right? And like they left them there. So that theory was out there for like a day, and everybody followed it, and then it was gone. The next theory that was out there briefly, and I had this theory, frankly, was that the theory was politically connected, or that the murder was politically connected. I mean, you cannot rise in elective office without making some enemies. And, you know, of course, I had my share of enemies, and politics, thankfully, in 2013 was not quite as acrimonious as it is now. But for a while, I started to wonder, gee, where there's something where someone was trying to send me a message. I had a group of very eccentric individuals who had followed me around and like dumped fake blood at press conferences and things like that. It was a random issue. But the police also dismissed that quite quickly. They said, Mike, you know, look, you have two houses, one in the capital, one in Los Angeles. Your addresses are public. You know, your office is a public place. You know, like everybody, like if they were trying to get you, they would have gotten you. Okay, so as hard as that was to hear, right? You know, it was that theory was then dismissed. The next lead that dominated things, I would say for 7 years, came also from another member of my father's community. And that one is one that I'll talk about, and, you know, feel free to ask whatever questions you have, but you'll see why I have a little bit of resent toward it and why I kind of feel like a fool for pushing it so much for the public. So there was a woman who was coming home that day from karate with her son right about 6 o'clock. And she encountered a guy breaking into cars on a street, a few streets from my dad. His neighborhood was built like a football stadium. Like there's a lake at the bottom, and then there's these different streets. And she was at one of the higher, you know, the cheap seats, for lack of a better word. And there was a guy who was sort of casually breaking into cars at the exact time that people come home from work and come home from extracurricular activities at school. And she, sort of confronted him, and then she called her neighbor, a male neighbor, and said, "Hey, there's a guy breaking into cars." And they both came out and like confronted the guy. Now he fled, or he ran, and he went down a walk street. There's these little tiny streets connecting the levels of the stadium, in my analogy. And he went down a walk street, which the police say they think he's a local because these streets are so tiny that you really don't know they exist unless you're a local. He also allegedly, according to the guy neighbor, he said something like, "Follow me and you'll die tonight," or something like that. Now, they did follow him, but they had to drive around this hairpin to get to where he had walked down on a walk street, and he was gone. He was gone. They said their path was blocked by a truck, but this is the key thing. Her son, who I think was 6 or 7 at the time, and he was in the back seat, later told police that he thought he saw that the guy had a gun. Okay, it was a child who said this. Now, this is where the theory gets weird. Okay, so you're going to have to follow me with this because this is what the police said. So I said, okay, so give me your profile. Explain to me how this guy killed my father. Because I will say, at any given time in Los Angeles or Manhattan or Chicago, somebody's breaking into a car within a 20-block radius of anything, right? Like, you can't really attribute that much significance to it. So they said, okay, well, this is our theory. So he ran down the stairs, and he was probably right-handed, and right-handed people, when they're being chased, they tend to turn right. And so that got him towards your dad's street. And then he saw your dad's street, and your dad's street looked like an alley because my dad's street was really small. And so he ducked down your dad's street because he thought it was like an alley. But at that exact moment in time, there was a tour helicopter sending tourists to the Hollywood sign. My dad's street was in the flight path, very close to the Hollywood sign. So this tour helicopter was taking tourists to the Hollywood sign. But this guy thought it's a police helicopter. And he said, "I've got to get inside." And at that exact moment, your dad had bought a printer at Costco. And he went downstairs and said, "Ash, I can't get it out of the door of my car. I've got to get it out of the hatchback." And so he opened his garage door. There was no forced entry in my dad's house. So they've got to explain that, right? Yeah, no forced entry. So at that exact moment, your dad is pulling the printer out, and he pressed the garage door button, and the garage door is going down, and the guy dived in without being noticed. And then he sat in your father's garage for an hour and a half while my father set up his printer, because they know he did this. They know he bought a printer. They know he set it up, right? He played around in his computer. They know that somebody was on his computer. There was some email sent and something like that. So in their theory, the guy sat in my father's garage for an hour or an hour and a half. I should also state, there were lots of valuables in my dad's garage. He could have grabbed a whole bunch of stuff, pressed the button, and walked out. There were 3 cars in my dad's driveway, 3. So this guy knows it's an inhabited house, right? Yeah. He doesn't know who. My dad could have 2 sets of, he could have 10 sons, right? 10 6'5" sons, right? Or, he could have roommates that are retired law enforcement, right? I mean, the point is, it's an inhabited house with 3 cars present, and this guy knows that. But in the police's theory, at some point, he decided to walk up into the inhabited house. And he didn't steal anything from the bottom story or the second story and just walk out. He didn't steal anything out of the garage and just walk out. He walked all the way upstairs to the 3rd floor, shot my dad. And you think that this is weird so far, but it gets even weirder. He then watched him die. He then sat there and watched my father die.
Now, why did they think that?
Because my father's bedroom was ransacked, partially ransacked. And for this theory to work, it's a binary switch. Either my dad got home and found someone in his house who had already ransacked, or my dad was home already. Somebody entered the house, killed him, and then did the ransacking after. And the ransacking was partial. It wasn't like somebody had gone through the whole house.
So it wasn't like they were looking for something.
Well, no, it did appear that they were looking for something, but the police believe that the person took about an hour to ransack, right? Because, there was some envelopes pulled open. They tried to get into some safes. They did get into a file cabinet, So that theory, and by the way, whoever was there either tried to get into a safe, and by a safe, I mean an old-fashioned, like Western movie Wells Fargo safe where like the wall is like as thick as my hand with a pair of garden scissors. Okay. So the police have acknowledged, as you're smiling, like the police have acknowledged that this was either somebody
confused.
Somebody who was either very stupid or somebody who was staging the crime scene. Because, obviously, I don't think anybody on this podcast, myself included, is around safes that often, but I think most people listening understand that with a tempered steel wall that is 4 inches thick, you're not getting in that safe with a pair of garden shears, right? So this was the dominant theory in my dad's case for years.
And that was through the police department or the law enforcement.
The woman who saw this guy, the car burglar, circulated the theory to the media. The media picked it up and ran with it. The police had to investigate it. They ended up talking with the people who saw the assailant, and they asked the man and the woman, "Could you draw a sketch?" And they said, "We didn't see the guy's face. No way we can draw a sketch." And then they asked the boy, "Could you draw a sketch?" And he said yes. And so we ended up with a sketch of this guy who looks like any generic Caucasian or Hispanic person, right? And then, what I did, because something about this theory just didn't run well with me, I ended up calling all of the people who had information. So I called the woman and I said, there's some things that this person did that kind of make us think that if this was my dad's killer, it was sort of like a crackhead. And she goes, "Oh no, the guy was dressed really nice. He looked like an Eastern European hitman." That was her words. I called the guy. Did the guy look like he was high on drugs? No, he didn't look like he was high on drugs. I mean, you can't always tell that, but I interviewed, all the people who had some information here, except for the young boy. But I learned, that even the people who saw him, had some serious doubts whether this was related. And, for me, the theory would only make sense if this person breaking into cars had a serious drug habit. And that's how you could make some of the weird things make sense. But I will say this, if you are breaking into cars with a gun, first of all, you're turning something that in California is a misdemeanor and you'll not even spend a day in jail. You're turning it into a felony. So very few people do that. Secondly, if you have a gun, you just go and hold somebody up. You don't necessarily break into cars. So the theory.
The other thing that doesn't make sense to me is, why is he breaking into cars if he's so well dressed?
Correct.
That is just that just resonates with me. Like, really, that just doesn't make sense.
Correct. Now, if he was part of a gang and he had some means, and this is what they did, okay, but again, it just the whole part of it, just so many things would have to align for this theory to make sense that it just, for me, it's always been a little bit shaky.
Yeah, it sounds it to me. Now, you said she went to the one of the witnesses went to news media and spread this theory.
She did.
Wow.
What she did is she sent an email around to maybe 30 members of the community.
Why?
She said, "This is what I saw, and I'm worried it's connected." And then the media got a hold of the email, and then they contacted her.
Why would she do that?
Well, I think she was trying to help. I really do think she was trying to help. And I think she was trying to record her memory while it was still fresh. But it's also possible that she was also just somebody who was really upset that somebody was breaking into cars on her street, and she wanted the police to try to catch that person. Things like this have happened in my dad's case.
Wow.
We hate to do this to you, but we have to break for our sponsors. Thanks for hanging in there. Now back to the episode.
Can you talk a little bit about your dad? Because we're very much a victim focused podcast. I would love to know, what was he like? Was he funny? What did he? Obviously, he liked to collect some. He was a collector.
Yeah.
What was he like? What was he like as a dad?
Sure. So my dad grew up in really just crushing poverty, right? His dad was an immigrant coal miner. He spent the first part of his life, going from being a farmer in Italy to being underground. My grandfather, many, many hours a day. At some point, my dad's father got a job shoveling coal into a steel furnace, and that was an upgrade. But my grandfather had a drinking problem, and so he drank most of his salary. My dad grew up in the Great Depression. I want to say he had rickets as a kid from malnutrition. So he spent the rest of his life sort of working to chase that poverty. He worked harder than anybody I've ever known. When I was a kid, he had 3 jobs. And I always asked him, like, why? And he said, well, I don't want you guys to live through what I went through. Mm-hmm. I would see him every day. He would get up at 5 a.m, prepare his lessons, and then he would go drive about 30, 40 minutes and then teach school. He was a school teacher. He would come home, change clothes, and then he would go to his other job. He had a job at night at Dodger Stadium in the food concessions. Wow. And then on Saturday, he had a 3rd job. And he did this, to give us a better life. And he did. Of course, he wasn't always present as a kid, and I've worked to be more present in my children's lives, but it was a different generation, and I forgive him, and I completely understand given his background. To give you a sense of his dedication to his students, my father was a school teacher for 47 years. In 47 years, wow, he did not miss a single day of school. I want to repeat that. 47 years, and the school district certified it at his retirement. He did not miss a single day of school. I should also stress that the last couple of years of his life, this is how dedicated he was. Last couple of years of his career, this is how dedicated he was to his students. My father worked for free. And people are like, what do you mean? Well, between his military service plus 47 years and the pension formula, he could have retired at like year 43 at 100% salary. I mean, he would have literally gotten paid 100% of his salary to just do whatever he wanted and, travel the world. But he kept working, and he was working for free. I mean, he literally was working for free. And so he was tremendously, tremendously dedicated. When I spoke at his funeral, the funeral was at a church, his church, our church, my church, that maybe seats, 200, 300 people. There were 1,200 people there. Wow. He touched so many people's lives. I mean, I remember asking, if you're a student of my father's, stand up. And like 3/4 of the audience stood up. He just was a very dedicated, very hardworking guy. In terms of the human side of him, he was just, first of all, peak health. He was really, really strong. He was really big boned and really full of life. I mean, he was sprinting upstairs in his 70s. He was, deadlifting trees, deadlifting refrigerators. I mean, he was a strong, healthy, very full of life guy. He was a Renaissance man. This is something that I, really like. The biggest way that I would define him beyond what I said about duty and hard work is a Renaissance man. This was somebody who could, take apart an engine with me, but then, go paint a painting. Like, he's skilled at both. He could wire a home with me, and he could go talk about the proper way to prune a peach tree so that the blossoms were beautiful and so the fruit was good quality. I mean, he was just such a well-rounded person. And then above all, he was a very, very at this stage in his life when he was killed, he was a doting grandfather. My younger sister had a son that my father loved very much. And at that point, I had my oldest daughter, who my father loved very much, and he had just met my youngest daughter. So he was above all a very, very doting grandfather. And one of the things that's really just so hard for me is that he never got to meet my son, who was born after, he died, of course, who we named after him, but who has a lot of the characteristics that my dad had. And but he was a terrific human being. That's the thing, is like, sometimes people are killed and it's like, well, they had enemies, or they were hanging out at a gambling den at 2 a.m, right? And you don't blame those victims. You never do that, but you kind of understand it better. But my father was a beloved member of the community killed in his bedroom.
It doesn't make sense.
It doesn't.
Yeah. Wow. Sounds like he was an incredible man.
Yeah.
It's going to be so hard not to see justice for him. I
Yeah.
can't imagine. Well, I kind of
Well, you
can because
can.
I've never
You
seen
can.
justice for myself, but
Yeah.
I survived, and it's
That's
the not knowing the answers is just the
correct.
worst.
Correct.
It's just
Correct.
you want answers,
I was going to
and
say,
it's
you know that, and you understand that. It is just the weirdest thing is it's the reporter's questions. Why? How? When? Like, we know the where, but the
the why
why,
is the huge.
yeah. And it just
Yeah.
that part is really tough. And just, I mean, aside from the emotional connections, there's the human logical mystery thing. Like, why did this happen? Like, you want to know. You just want to know.
Do you think that's what sort of drove you, or do you want to talk a little bit about why you chose to actually publish the book?
Yeah, great question. So I published the book for two reasons. The first one was during at that time, 10 years since my father's death, I had gotten very active in the victims movement. I had spoken at rallies and I had talked with a lot of families. And, I had always done so pretty low key, but I had gotten to meet so many different victims, families, or, families of murder victims, I guess would be the way to say it. And, at some point, a couple things dawned on me. First of all, thankfully, most of the public will never experience what it's like. So they don't understand. And, the questions you get and the policies we vote for, people don't understand. People don't understand what victims' families are going through. And then I realized at some point, I'm very fortunate. I have a platform. I'm on the news a couple times a week. I have a very active Twitter following, so on and so forth. And thankfully, I can appear on a podcast like yours. And I'm really lucky to have that. Most victims don't have that. Most victims' families don't have that. And so I wanted to give the world a little window into what they go through. Because look, if a case like my dad's is unsolved, I feel like there's not enough resource. I mean, you imagine the people out there who are sort of, toiling in anonymity. By the way, that was always a metric that I had when I was in office. Like, if I went to the Department of Motor Vehicles to renew my license and they knew who I was and they treated me like crap, it was like, oh my God, how is the public treated, right? And so that's the main thing is I did this for the people who are just in anonymity and they're waiting for answers in their cases. And then the second thing was I have this hope or this fantasy that somebody will read my book and they'll say, oh my gosh, like, yeah, like there was a young man who came home in a pool of sweat that day and he then took off and moved, and and that somebody will step forward, somebody knows something, or somebody will read all the clues that I put in the book and they'll be like, well, it's got to be this, right? And so I don't know. So far the case has not been solved though since the book was published.
Was law enforcement supportive of you putting out the book as well, especially since you did have theories and tips and that sort of thing? And I'm just curious.
I didn't ask them. I didn't ask them about the book.
Good for you.
Up until that point, I had asked for permission for everything. I would get contacted by television shows and I would say, hey, I'm thinking of going on this show. And they would always say, no, don't do that. Don't do that. And at some point it was like, I'm sorry, I'm doing it. I mean, the LAPD is very territorial and parochial and they don't want people. I understand no department wants people raising awareness that there's a case that's unsolved. But at some point, I just felt like the stories had to be told.
I'm sorry, I got a chuckle because New Hampshire, it's been like a big secret that New Hampshire has 130 unsolved missing and murdered cases in the cold case unit alone in New Hampshire. And we started a coalition and we teamed up with a lot of families that have their loved ones' cases are unsolved. And we have been splashing that everywhere because we feel that people should know that there are this many unsolved cold cases, not active, cold cases in a very small state like New Hampshire. And
Sure.
they weren't very happy about it. um,
Yeah.
they're not very happy with me right now, but I really don't care. I didn't put myself in this position. The person that did this to me put me in this position, and
Sorry.
it's so we've been really trying to get the cold case unit to solve some of these cases. They have new technology now. I mean,
Yeah.
they have cases that are 50 years old that are unsolved,
Yeah.
and they really they have the technology today. They have so much more than they did then,
Yeah. Good
and
for you.
I feel like that they should be solving some of these cases.
Yeah.
Like, come on now, and a lot of it is the money and the resources. And
Yeah.
we've kind of contradicted them on that, or we made them think, because we've had several we've talked to a few organizations that do free DNA testing
Yeah.
on evidence, and so they kind of yeah, they can't use that excuse anymore about the
Yeah.
resources. So it's frustrating, very, very frustrating.
It's frustrating indeed, and especially in my dad's case, sometimes I've connected them to resources, and then they say, "Well, no, it's not the money anymore. It's a policy. We don't release evidence to a third
Right.
party." And it's like, "Oh my God!" Like, I
I
mean,
don't get
take
it.
the help.
Don't, and that's
Mm,
the thing with New Hampshire. They don't want help. Um, you know, with my case in the Connecticut River Valley cases, it's Vermont and New Hampshire. So because it's two states, they had the opportunity to have the FBI come in and
Yeah,
investigate some of these cases, or these cases. They turned them down. Like,
that's crazy.
turn them down. Like, why? Why don't you want these cases solved?
That's
It's
crazy.
almost like they put that in my mind, that they don't want these cases solved. It's so frustrating, and it's like, what is wrong with getting help? Like,
Yeah,
they will not, New Hampshire will not do anything on TV, like any
yeah,
interviews or anything like that. It's
yeah.
like
Which is
very
weird.
little information goes out. It's
Yeah.
like, why?
No, it's the same. It's the same. It's the same here, and it's amazing, right? Because sometimes you'll read about a department that's the opposite. Like,
Yeah.
I feel like I read this article every year. So and so in this little small town police department, he was about to retire, but there was a case that really bothered him, and he took it personally. And so he put out a call, and he talked with genealogists, and he talked with these people. He talked with these people, and he involved this lab, and they solved the case before he. And you read that article once a year, and then you have, like, New Hampshire in your case, or my LAPD in my case, and it's just like, I don't understand it. But I do have a theory, right? I mean, like, look, when LAPD finally solved the Grim Sleeper case, it was 30 women who were, I believe, raped and murdered and it was like in an 8-block area. Once that case was solved, the question was like, why wasn't this solved before? Right. And I think the departments are worried about that type of press. Like, well, this was solvable. Like, why wasn't it solved before? But let's be honest, people would just be so happy and so relieved. I don't think anybody's like, if your case is solved, you'd be grateful. You'd be thankful. Like,
Oh, absolutely.
yeah.
Mhm. Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
I was just going to say, yeah, I think the potential of highlighting inefficiencies, or you may have done this or this or this, and this wasn't necessarily protocol. I think that you may definitely be right, that may be a fear, sort of like damaging to the ego, or policies and procedures, specifically within a department. But you're also 1,000% right with, everybody is just going to be so thankful and so glad that there actually is some resolution.
for sure. For sure.
Yeah. We're trying to get the New Hampshire Cold Case Unit and the AG's office to change and update some of their procedures, because they're using procedures they were using 40, 50 years ago.
Which is
And
crazy.
you know what? They need to change. They need to update. And that's what our coalition is fighting for right now.
Yeah.
We're trying to get some legislators involved.
Yes. Yes.
So that's been, we're in the process of doing that right now. And these families deserve better.
I totally agree.
Totally deserve
And
better.
people sometimes ask me, like, if I could wave a magic wand, what would I do to change policies? And I always identify two. The first one would be something that you could do that's concrete. I would like to see the federal government portion money for all the law enforcement agencies around the country, specifically to test cold cases, with the realization that some departments just really don't know. There are small departments like in the, across the country that really don't understand how much the technology has advanced, like you said. And I'd like them to give the money to say, I mean, look, DNA solves the worst crimes. It's usually rape and murder or a serious assault, right? And so, like, let's put money out there and let's solve these cold cases, because by retesting the evidence, by putting it in the lab, like, we can solve a lot of these cases. Yeah. So I think that's a resources and, whatever, like having society get to that tipping point. The second thing, you can't really solve with a policy. It's just more cultural. I just like to see departments, focus on prioritizing cold cases and also talking with people in addition to the DNA and the fingerprints and all that stuff. And just, that's sort of a cultural shift, but obviously you can't legislate that.
Yeah. That's true.
Well, thank you guys. I look forward to the episode. As soon as I see it, I'll post it everywhere. And
oh, great.
Yeah.
That'd be awesome. Thank you so much for
likewise. Enjoy the rest of your day.
You too. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you all for listening to this episode of Invisible Tears. Make sure you subscribe to our podcast so you don't miss any future episodes. You can find us on all platforms through our link tree in the show notes. There you can find our social media platforms, our YouTube, and our website with our merch. You can also find our Patreon there. So if you're interested in supporting and joining the Invisible Tears team, join our Patreon today. And as always, ratings and recommendations help our podcast in algorithms. So if you haven't shown us some love and given us a 5-star rating and review, please do so. We appreciate each and every one of you and your continued support.